Okay, so I have a MacBook Pro 13-inch over here where my hand is. It has 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage. So it's a nice machine. Over here, I have a entry-level MacBook Air. It has 8 gigabytes of storage and 256 gigabytes of storage. I'm sorry, it has 8 gigabytes of RAM. It also has 8 performance cores and 7 GPU cores, and this has 8 performance cores and 8 GPU cores. So I want to get a feel for the differences and so on and so forth as far as performance, because I really don't think that there's a big performance difference. And I'm testing these out because I'm trying to decide which one to keep, the MacBook Pro or the MacBook Air. I don't do a lot of video editing, but I do want to have basically something that scales as far as my needs go. Most of the time I just need a very capable Chromebook. I'm doing most of my stuff on the web. And since I do most of my stuff on the web, I'm going to run a speedometer test and see how they compare. This is at browserbench.org. I didn't quite press these things at the same time, but close enough. Okay, so surprisingly enough, the MacBook Air came out slightly ahead, but that's within the margin of error, I'm sure. And the MacBook Pro scored 210. The MacBook Air scored 212. So pretty good. These MacBooks are very good when it comes to JavaScript performance. And I think we can move on to the next JavaScript test, which is Octane. So you may have noticed I've installed Chrome on both of these laptops because that's what I use, so that's what I want to benchmark. Okay, let's start. They both scored higher, but the MacBook Pro once again comes out ahead by less than 1,000 this time. So I'm going to say that the MacBook Pro is faster on Octane, very marginally, by let's just call it 1,000 points. It really doesn't matter. Now comes the real interesting part. Okay, so the MacBook Air scored 1,745 for the single core, which is pretty dang good, and it scored 7635 for the multi-core. Now let's see how the MacBook Pro scores. Okay, so we have 1745 single core and 7635 multi-core on the MacBook Air. And on the MacBook Pro, we have 1724 and 7560, which is a little strange. It's probably just statistical noise. That's probably within the margin of error. So let's upload that to my Geekbench account. Alright. Well, now let's try compute. This is where we should see a real difference. So I am gonna run OpenCL. Well, let's run Metal because that's Apple's thing. Oh yeah, I forgot. So strangely enough, the Geekbench from the Apple Store does not have metal as one of the compute AIs. Don't ask me why. So I'm just going to run it with OpenCL. Still should prove the point that with the compute that leans on the graphics card, we should see that the MacBook Pro pulls out ahead by a couple percent, by 15 to 20%, because it has one extra core as opposed to 7 cores with the MacBook Air. Yep, just as I thought, and it's quite a bit different. So it's $18,776 for the MacBook Pro and $16,083 for the MacBook Air. And as far as percentages, let's do something real quick like this. 16,083 divided by 18,776. So yeah, the MacBook Pro is 15% faster on graphic stuff. So we kind of expected that. So now we haven't seen any dramatic differences between these two. Just expected differences because of the number of cores, but nothing that would make me think that, I really should get the Pro over the Air, or the Air is a better value. Right now, they're about what and what as far as day-to-day performance. They're close enough. And for $1,000 as opposed to $1,800, the Air seems like the better buy. But what happens when we stress it out? What happens when we do something that requires a fan? Quite frankly. So let's fire up Cinebench for multi-core on both of them and see what happens then. So this is going to take 10 minutes, and I'm pretty sure you all don't want to sit here and watch these things render out for 10 minutes. And frankly, I don't have enough space for it, so we're going to cut off here and come back once the test is done. Okay, so wow, I am pretty impressed. The MacBook Pro got 7673 on Cinebench R23, and the MacBook Air got 6758. So some of that's probably due to the cooling factor, the fact that the MacBook Pro actually has a fan to prevent thermal throttling. Some of it's also probably due to the fact that there's only 7 GPU cores on the MacBook Air as opposed to the MacBook Pro. So that's significant. So for long-running processes, the MacBook Pro can't hold up, or rather the MacBook Air can't hold up to the MacBook Pro because of the cooling. And it took about 10 minutes for that process to run. So I imagine there would be an even bigger, a more dramatic increase in the difference between the scores if I let this actually run for maybe 30 minutes, which may be what I'll do next. So that's actually pretty impressive that the MacBook Air scored that much higher. And that is 7673 divided by 6758. That's not as big a difference as I thought. As proportion wise, it's 13.5%. So if we round it up, the MacBook Pro scored 14% higher, and it scored 14% higher in another test that's driven by graphics. So this is probably more driven by the graphics than the cooling. So it'd be interesting to know again, if I ran this for 30 minutes, how it would turn out. I don't know how to set up Cinebench to do that, but I will try to find out. Okay, so I figured out how to stress test this thing for 30 minutes, or these things for 30 minutes. And I've set that up. And here's my prediction that the difference between them is going to grow substantially, because thermal throttling is going to kick in. And it won't just be about the graphics cores, it'll be about heat. Okay, it started. Okay, so really interesting results after a 30-minute stress test. Looks like the Cinebench on the MacBook Pro with a fan and the extra GPU core is 7673. Sorry that you all maybe can't see that. And the Cinebench on the MacBook Air is 6567. So that's actually not a dramatic drop. So it seems like thermal throttling seems to level off at a certain point. So between 10 minutes and 30 minutes, we haven't seen that much of a degradation in performance with the MacBook Air using only passive cooling. So just for giggles, let's divide 76 73 by 6567, and we get 16.8% faster. So just call it 17% faster. So it's 17% faster. So the MacBook Pro is 17% faster than the MacBook Air, which I think that margin grew. So thermal throttling does come into effect, but it's only a minor effect, and it's after 30 minutes. So that's actually pretty impressive. This actually makes me think that a MacBook Air with 8 cores probably wouldn't perform too much worse than the MacBook Pro, except after maybe 15 to 30 minutes of hard work. The MacBook Air is fairly warm underneath with passive cooling, and the MacBook Pro is cooler. Subjectively, it's cooler. I don't have a FLIR camera or anything like that to prove it, but it does seem cooler. Okay, let's look into something that will measure gaming performance, that is GFX Metal. I'll close down these other programs. Don't need a web browser open. Don't need messages open. Same thing over here for the Air. And again, this is a GFX Bench is a test of gaming performance So it should give a good idea of how well these laptops hold up when running some fairly modern games. So wow, the GFX graphics test took a long time to run, but had some interesting results. Just looking at the first test, Aztec Ruins high tier, the MacBook Air got 49.7, just call it 50 frames a second, and the MacBook Pro got 55.1 frames per second, so just call it 55. So there's just a 5 frame difference, so that's a 10% difference. So with the let me just randomly pick one. This Car Chase. The MacBook Air was 57.0 frames per second, and the MacBook Pro was 59.9, just call it 60 frames a second. So that's not even a 10% difference. That's like a 5% difference. And bear in mind that we've been running tests on these things, so they're both warmer than usual. So the MacBook Air has had to sort of go it alone without fans. So I'm actually pretty impressed. So now let's see, what other tests can we run? We can test the disk out. So you can run some Blackmagic Disk Mark. See if there's any real difference between these disks. And I don't think that there will be. Alright, let's start. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, and it could be because of the disk size, but the write speed is significantly faster on the MacBook Pro. The read speeds are about the same, 2876.9, 2865.1. The read speeds are about the same, but the write speeds are significantly different. The MacBook Pro is getting like 2757. The MacBook Air is getting like 2111. So I will chalk that up to the size of the hard drive. The hard drive is bigger, or should I say the solid state drive is bigger on the MacBook Pro, so I'm going to assume that's why it's running significantly faster. But I would also make the assumption that if I spent another $200, that I could get the better write speeds on the MacBook Air. And by the same token, if I got the MacBook Pro with only 256 gigs, I'm assuming that I would only be getting about 2100 megabytes on write. So it really depends on disk size, in my opinion. I don't know that for a fact. Just for grins, I know you all can't see that, and I'm gonna try to zoom in on it in post, but I don't think I'll be successful. But the time remaining on battery for the MacBook Air is 1 hour less than the time remaining on battery for the MacBook Pro. So the MacBook Pro has significantly more battery life. So it's 1 hour's difference. They've both been on battery for about 2 hours and 30 minutes. And I've been testing them both on battery for about that time, but they still have a significant difference in battery life. So the MacBook Pro wins on that one, definitely. It gets an hour extra. It has an hour more battery life left because the battery is bigger in the MacBook Pro. So based on what I've seen, this laptop is not $800 better than this laptop. The MacBook Pro is faster, and it does perform faster in some benchmarks by about 10 to 15% sometimes, but I'm not going to notice that in everyday use. So when I am surfing the web, or on occasion when some games come out for the Mac, playing some games, I don't think that I'm going to see that 10 or 15%. Now, where I will see things maybe is in anything that pushes the RAM, because this MacBook Pro has 16 gigabytes of RAM and this MacBook Air only has 8. Where I also see something is if whenever I'm doing a lot of writes to disk, the disk is significantly slower. We're talking 2700 versus 2100 as far as writes. So that's a substantial difference. As a matter of fact, 27 divided by 21, that is a 28.5 or 29% speed difference between the MacBook Pro on writes. And I'm going to say that that's because the hard drive is bigger. And it's my understanding that larger hard drives add up to more performance, because the read speeds are about the same, 2800 megabytes a second. So yeah, last thing, it has better battery life. It has a brighter screen. I know this because the screen brightness is rated at 500 on the MacBook Pro and 400 on the MacBook Air. And that'll come into play if I'm ever sitting outside. I will notice that difference, because I've had MacBook Airs with 400 nits and I've cranked it all the way up, and it's still, the screen is still kind of washed out by the outside light. So that'll be an issue, but I'm very seldom outside with my computer. So if that does happen, I'll just have to grin and bear it. The touch bar is kind of cute, and I might be one of the few people that actually prefer the touch bar over the physical keys, because I don't use function keys that much anyway, and I prefer to have a cute gadgety looking touch bar. But I can live without it, because mainly the only thing I do with it is adjust the volume and the brightness of the screen, which I can do with function keys. Overall, that is what I would conclude, is that the MacBook Air, for most people, especially in this price range, in this power range, would be the right way to go. The only thing I can think of is if I could somehow find out a way to stress the memory on this and see how big of a difference it is. But in everyday use, the MacBook Air is just fine, and it's $300 less than the MacBook Pro. And in my case, it's actually $800 less, because this MacBook Pro has 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gigabyte hard disk.